Good evening, everyone. Patrick and I have quite a bit of material to go through, but our number one objective is really if you have specific questions or some idea or concept that you'd like to discuss, that would be our number one goal, is to make sure that those questions get answered. Now, it may happen through the material that we have, but please, as we go through what we've got together, please feel free to ask any questions and stop us as we move through the material. Now, as Tom said, Patrick and I are with Ehlers and Associates, and our office is over in Roseville. The two of us work almost exclusively in western Wisconsin with towns, villages, and cities on financing related issues. And what we'd like to do today is really more at a high level talk about some of the issues and opportunities and challenges that are involved with the issuance of municipal debt. And in that effort, we'll go through different options that you have, participants in the process itself, and also some of the legal considerations that are involved with the issuance of debt. Well, to start out with, in terms of a strategy in approaching the issuance of debt, there's a couple of components that we believe need to be in place in order for any debt-related transaction to be successful. And those would be that you as the issuer understand what your options are, that you're receiving clear and understandable information about the different options that you choose and what the implications will be of choosing those options. Like everything else, municipal debt has a lot of rules and regulations, and you as an issuer don't have to be an expert on that, but it helps to have a working knowledge of what those rules and regulations are. There are a number of participants in a governmental debt or municipal debt transaction, and it's important for you to understand who those participants are, and also, and most importantly, who do they represent in the transaction. And finally, the actual logistics of selling a debt issue. Again, you don't have to be a PhD on this to be able to vote on it and understand it, but developing a base level and being able to ask questions about it is what's really most important. So those are the areas we hope to focus on in our discussion with you this evening. Okay, well, starting right at the ground level, the first question that you would ask is, we've got a project that our community is interested in completing and doing and moving forward on. How are we going to pay for this project? The choice really falls into two different categories. You can use cash, or what we would call a pay-as-you-go approach to pay for a project. Very attractive option in that you don't incur any interest or additional expenses in doing so. But it won't always fit. And that leaves us with the other option, which is a debt-related option or a borrowing option for a project. You're perfect segue, actually. It is, and I'll actually start on that, on the fourth bullet point on why it would be that you would decide to borrow. One of the changes that people in our profession, Patrick and I's profession, what we've noticed since the advent of levy limits is many projects that a community historically would have chosen to pay cash or build into their annual levy have gotten squeezed out. And you're left with the option of using debt. Why is that? Because debt is one of the very few exceptions to the implications of levy limits. And it provides you an opportunity to go up and above or outside of levy limits. And one of the reasons we're seeing more of it for all types of projects, not just long-term capital assets, but even shorter-term capital assets that historically were paid with cash. A couple other reasons why a borrowing would be chosen instead of cash is it's an opportunity to match up the useful life of an asset and have that asset be charged against the individuals, the citizens who are hopefully benefiting from it, whether that be a street or a municipal building. The hope with borrowing is you're matching up beneficiaries with payers. Another is that you as government officials working within a budget, you need to manage what the tax rate, what the fees are going to be. And if you're paying cash or building things into your budget every year, and it happens one year and then it doesn't happen for a couple years, you could be dealing with spikes up and down. And that can make for a very confusing situation for the citizenry to understand, as well as levy limits, too, in that same situation. One other rationale for borrowing is, again, as municipal officials, you're dealing with the year-to-year cash flow of your community. You're also dealing with the management of the savings account of that community or your fund balance. And using cash can be a significant drain on your ability and your flexibility in managing cash flow and your fund balance. So all of those are reasons why you would consider the use of borrowing instead of using cash. And I think, again, as was stated, the levy limits is one of the primary factors that we're seeing more use of debt. Well, who helps you make those decisions? Who helps you analyze whether debt is going to need to be a part of a project and financing for a project? That is the role of the financial advisor. And one of the things I would mention is we are actually in the process of being transitioned from financial advisors to municipal advisors because we're under a new regulatory structure from the federal government. So that title will probably, on future slides you may see on a presentation like this, will read municipal advisor. Well, what is the role of the municipal advisor or financial advisor? They're really there to be your representative in the process of securing debt. And they're there to help you understand the options you have available to you under state rules, under federal rules. They're there to put together and work with you on a financing plan. The financial advisor, municipal advisor, is also there to help you determine what is the best process to secure financing? What is the best method of sale of your debt for your community, for your situation? And lastly, once those decisions have been made, it is the role of the financial advisor or the municipal advisor to take you through the execution or implementation of that finance plan. And as I mentioned, again, the financial advisor is there to be your representative in working in the capital finance market. A couple last things about the role of the financial advisor. As with many areas that you would find yourself dealing with, municipal debt has lots of disclosures and documents that need to be prepared as a part of a transaction. There's a legal side to that, as Tom could certainly tell you, and then there's also a fiscal side, and the combination of legal representatives and a financial advisor are where you'll see those offering and disclosure documents being prepared. We certainly approach our role as not a role in working with governmental entities as a one-time transaction, but we think it's as important to make you aware of long-term strategies, capital finance strategies, that'll help you make the best decision now, also looking into the future as well. And lastly, the financial advisor is the one representative and the one player in a transaction that owes you a fiduciary duty or a fiduciary responsibility. Basically meaning your needs need to come first before their own in a particular transaction. Okay, so at the point that a decision has been made that we've got a project that our community needs to deal with, and we've looked at preliminarily what are our options to pay for that project, and we believe that a financing is going to be necessary for it, the next step would be then developing the financing plan. And there's a number of different elements of that step. At the beginning is what you would describe certainly as a very simple question, but an important one. How much do we want to borrow? And we have seen over the years circumstances where all costs aren't necessarily considered, and it's just the construction or the asset itself, buying of a piece of equipment, that is considered, maybe not some of the preliminary costs, say if you're doing a street, the design, the bidding, the legal work, if you're doing assessments, anything like that. So always consider what soft costs are a part of an overall project when determining what you're going to need to borrow, because those costs in most cases are eligible to be included in a financing. Another area to consider in developing the finance plan is what are the sources of revenues that you anticipate using to pay the debt back. Very commonly, your tax levy will be the funding source, but depending on if you're a village or a city or you've got a sanitary district, you may be looking at utility rates to provide funding for a portion or all of a particular transaction. Or some communities have tax increment financing districts, and that may be the source of revenue that you intend to use to repay the debt. Another area for discussion on the finance plan is what is the term of repayment that you intend to use for your debt issue. There are certainly market and state and federal rules related to this. The biggest area, I guess, in terms of restriction, though, that I would suggest you always pay attention to is avoid at all costs situations where you're financing an asset over a longer period than that useful life of that particular asset. Because chances are you'll have to replace it, and you certainly don't want to be in a situation of paying for something that's is used up its useful life, and now you got to get into another financing for the next replacement of that asset. And finally, in developing a financing plan, there's maybe an extra focus on what we're doing right now, but our approach and what I think would be the most beneficial to you in making decisions for your community is spending just as much time looking at what is our existing situation as it pertains to debt. How much debt do we have outstanding? How are we repaying it? Looking at, in the context of a new project, looking at that existing situation, and then just as importantly, what do you as a community have coming up in the next couple of years? So that when it comes time to make your decision on a financing now, you're setting it up in a way that you're keeping as much flexibility and options available for what you may have 2, 3, 5 years down the road, and making sure you're not putting yourself in a position where you're tying your hands and reducing your flexibility to deal with those other needs that you may have coming forward in the next couple of years. Well, another element of developing the financing plan is deciding what is the security that you are going to pledge for the repayment of the debt that you're going to do. So just like if you're buying a new home, you have the home, and what is the collateral for the financing, the loan, the mortgage? It's on the home itself. Cars, it would be an auto loan based on the collateral being the car. With municipal debt, the collateral really falls into two different categories. One is debt that is backed by the full faith and credit of your municipality. That kind of debt is called general obligation debt. So when you issue that debt, you are backing it with a commitment of your community, not just in the year that you issue it, but for the whole duration of that debt issue, that you will levy a tax to pay that debt back. You can use other revenue sources, but absent those revenue sources, you will use that levy. The other option is revenue debt. And revenue debt can be debt that is backed by any revenue stream that your utility or your community has. It could be you have a water utility or sewer utility. It could be that. It could be a lease situation. Or if you have a tax increment district, it could be tax increment revenues that you have. You may ask, well, what of these options that we have, which one will result in the lowest cost to us? In general, that general obligation debt will result in the lowest cost, because that's the strongest pledge that you can make to someone who is lending you money for a particular project. All right, so also in the development of a financing plan, another question that you would have, and an area that you could certainly work with your financial or municipal advisor on, is where are we going to go to find a source for this financing, a way that we can secure funds for our project. I want to start out with talking about what we would call the commercial market. And the commercial market is really, could be statewide, could be national firms, could be banks, could be firms, could be underwriting organizations. That option is a really good fit, particularly for larger issues. We put a benchmark of over $1 million, as well as issues that maybe you're looking to pay back over a longer period of time, maybe up to a 20-year period in terms of repayment. In general, there are more costs upfront to issue debt that you're going to place in the commercial market, and there's more costs involved over the life of the issue in the management of that debt. So why would you do it? Well, in general, commercial market debt typically results in the lowest interest rates, and the lowest interest rates in the lowest interest cost over the life of the issue. And because interest cost is the largest cost of a debt issue, the commercial market is often the best choice in terms of accessing a source for your financing for a project. Now, in Wisconsin, you have the benefit of having very active local and regional banks in terms of their desire to buy debt and be involved in debt. And I should note, too, the commercial market, you also benefit that there are many purchasers who are interested in investing in the debt of governmental issuers, governmental entities, because it's a very secure debt, and they feel very confident that they're going to get the return that they expect on that investment. But local banks and regional banks are very common purchasers of debt from Wisconsin governmental entities. The cost of issuance for bank-related financing is in general a little bit lower than cost of issuance related to commercial market financing. Not in all cases, but generally that is the case. But there is something that you would probably end up having to get restricted a little bit in terms of choosing this as the best fit, and that is that the option of going beyond 10 years would be limited, not in all cases, but in many cases with choosing an option of financing through a local or a regional bank. Sometimes it's 5 years as well. But again, that's a very active market for debt issued by Wisconsin governmental entities. Another option that's unique to Wisconsin is the Board of Commissioners of Public Land has a loan program called the State Trust Fund Loan Program. And they operate this. It has very low cost of issuance in general to use this option. But the interest rates in general are a little bit higher on this choice as compared to some of the other ones that we've already talked about, the commercial market and local or regional banks. They just will set an interest rate on a periodic basis, and then that's what it is for the next 6 months, sometimes a year. So this is a nice tool to have in the tool chest as a potential financing source. It's also one that I find particularly a good fit if you're ever in an instance where you're working with a developer or a business and they're asking you to do a financing that would be considered private activity rather than governmental activity. You are allowed to participate in that. Patrick will talk a little bit more about this in a couple of slides. This program can be a real good fit when those sorts of issues are presented to you. Couple last sources of financing are programs offered also by the state of Wisconsin and the federal government. And in general, these programs are best fit with utility financing, so sewer utilities and water utility. The DNR, in conjunction with the DOA in Wisconsin, coordinates the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program, which is a subsidized interest rate program for water projects that your community would have. It's a competitive program, so it doesn't have unlimited funds, but it is a very attractive program if you qualify for it, because I think generally the interest rates right now are 20 years under 2%, I think in most cases. The other program, the Clean Water Fund Loan Program, is a little more prevalent. It's related to sewer projects. It also has a subsidized interest rate, and it's available for pretty much any qualifying project. It has a much larger pool of funds than the Safe Drinking Water Loan. USDA Rural Development, that's a program run by the federal government. Again, we see that being a fit most commonly for utility, water, or sewer related projects. They offer fixed rate financing at very reasonable rates for up to a 40-year term of repayment. The advantage of that being that you keep your annual payments, kind of like choosing a 30-year mortgage as compared to a 15-year mortgage. You keep your annual payments as low as possible. The negative side, though, is you're paying the debt back over 40 years. And as I'd mentioned before, one of the keys, I think, when you're making decisions about debt is this asset that we're going to be financing, is the useful life of that 40 years? Because you don't want to get caught in that situation where you're, again, paying for something beyond its useful life. Both of these programs, not in all cases, but in a number of cases, are accompanied by grant funding being available for the project as well. So that can make them extra attractive in certain circumstances. Okay, another element in the financing plan, and this is one that you would spend time talking about with your municipal advisor, with your financial advisor, is how do we want to go about the actual process of getting the debt? What will be our method of sale? And in terms of a spectrum or a continuum, really falls into two categories or two options. We believe that the default option for you should be a competitive offering, or an offering that you put together with your financial advisor, the terms and conditions under which you're going to offer this debt issue, and then you ask, much like you would for any construction project that you're doing, you ask for proposals at a specific date and time. And then you have laid out, again with your advisor, the process and the criteria under which you're going to decide what the best bid is. That option works very well for debt that is clearly understood by purchasers who are interested in the debt. General obligation debt falls very much so into that category and fits very well with competitive offerings. Now, if you find yourself, though, in a situation where you have a more unique type of debt offering, maybe it's you have a new revenue stream that you haven't had historically but you're expecting, and you want to use that revenue stream as what you pledge for the debt, it may be a better decision to bring in a party who's going to buy that debt early in the process and work with them throughout the whole process. That's called a negotiated offering. Our recommendation would be, even if you're going to do that, and there are situations that is the best fit, we would recommend at that front end going through a competitive process to select that party whom you're going to work with, so that there is some thresholds that you've laid out and some expectations right up front through that competitive situation leading to a negotiated offering. And the final area I want to just briefly touch on before turning it over to Patrick is the structuring of the repayment of an issue. And just a couple things to think about. I already mentioned the useful life of an issue, of a project that you're financing, and matching that up with the repayment schedule. A couple other areas. When you do a debt issue, you want to make sure that you are putting in some provisions that will allow you to prepay that issue early should that opportunity present itself, or refinance the issue so you can get into a lower interest rates should they become available. If you don't ask that question, it's not uncommon for debt to be not callable at all. And so you'll have a 5-year period or a 10-year period where you are stuck with the payments, and there's nothing you can do about that. So certainly an area you'll want to discuss with your advisor is, are we going to put a call provision in this such that we have the ability to prepay the debt early or pay it off at any time, and make that a part of the process of developing the financing plan. Talked a little bit earlier about understanding what revenue you anticipate using to pay a debt issue back, and doing what you can to match the repayment period with what that revenue source will be. And finally, as I mentioned, we think it's very important to look at your existing debt situation and what you have coming in the future when deciding on the best way to finance a particular project. With looking at your existing debt, one of the things that we commonly see is maybe you had a debt issue that you've done a number of years ago that's going to be paid off soon. It makes a lot of sense to structure a new issue to wrap around that debt with the goal of eliminating maybe a spike up in your levy because of a new project and financing for a new project that you're bringing on. So all those attributes come into play when you're discussing again with your advisor, how do we want to put this together? What would be a best way that's going to fit us, fit our situation and fit what we've already obligated ourselves to? Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick, if there's any questions at this point on material, I'd be happy to answer those, but we could also pick up any questions at the end as well if they come up then.
Okay. Thank you, Sean. So once you've gone through the process of making all of the decisions that Sean was talking about, it's time to actually prepare for selling your debt. And there are a few items that you have to take care of to get to that point. First of all, you have to pass whatever kinds of initial authorizations might be required depending on your type of municipality. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. In some cases, this relates primarily to commercial market transactions. You need to prepare offering documents, which typically take the form of a preliminary official statement, or if you're working with a bank, maybe just a bank solicitation to them that will lay out the terms and conditions that you're seeking bids on. You need review by bond counsel, who I'll talk about in just a moment. They're a very important player in a lot of these transactions. And then in some cases, you need to get a credit rating for your debt. So this is the point at which you would engage another entity in the transaction, which is called bond counsel. So this is an attorney that specializes in the issuance of municipal debt. And what this person is here to do is to provide a legal opinion that benefits both you, the issuer, as well as the purchasers of the debt. And some of the opinions that they will provide in these transactions are, first of all, that it's just a legal contract, that essentially your debt has been issued properly and it's truly debt that is owed by your community. That's important to whoever is holding that debt. In a lot of cases, they'll be rendering an opinion that the interest on that debt is exempt from federal income taxation. I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, but a lot of municipal debt is tax exempt. And as a result of that, you get lower rates than might otherwise be available in the market. And then finally, they will weigh in on a variety of state and federal regulations that relate to municipal debt. And again, we'll go over some of those here in just a moment. They're also going to draft all of your legal documents related to the transaction, so any meeting notices, resolutions that you need to pass, certificates after the fact, and then they provide a lot of assistance when it comes to closing the transaction to make sure that all of the required documents have been signed and that everything is in order. And then when all that's over, they will provide to you a transcript that gives you all of the key legal documents that you might need as records going forward. In terms of how bond counsel gets paid, they'll be paid at the end of a transaction. Though it's important to note that what you are paying them as part of the debt transaction goes to benefit everyone that's involved. It benefits both the issuer as well as the purchasers of the debt. They rely on some of the legal opinions that the bond attorneys will write. Now, it would be nice if municipal debt was simple, but there are a ton of federal regulations related to it. And a lot of those regulations relate to the fact that quite a bit of municipal debt is exempt from federal income taxation. So that means that whoever it is that is holding your debt, when you pay interest on that, that interest income is not considered taxable. And this is a way that the federal government extends an implicit subsidy to municipal governments for doing projects like infrastructure development. You end up getting lower rates than you would otherwise if that interest income was taxed as regular income for the bondholders. So surrounding that, though, are a lot of regulations related to whether the debt can be tax exempt and maintaining that tax exempt status. Probably the most important of those is what Sean had alluded to earlier, which is referred to as private activity. And this is really the most basic question that you have to ask when you're trying to determine whether the debt that you're planning to issue is tax exempt. When you're looking at private activity and assessing this, you have to ask whether the debt passes or fails certain tests. And in order to maintain the tax exemption, you have to fail at least one of these two tests that's listed up here. The first is the private business use test, and you fail that test when more than 10% of the proceeds of your debt are used to benefit a private party. So the example that we have up here is maybe your municipality grades a site in order, as part of an incentive to bring in maybe a new manufacturing facility. You've expended those resources from your debt on a project that specifically benefits that private entity. So in that case, you would fail this private use test. The second test, though, is private security of payment test. And you fail this when more than 10% of the related debt service is secured by some kind of pledge from a private party. So to go along with that same example, if you had in place a guarantee that required that that manufacturing facility paid a certain amount of taxes in order to make sure that you can cover your debt service, that would be that kind of guarantee here that would cause you to fail the private security test. It's not necessarily a bad thing to fail both of these tests and not be able to issue tax-exempt debt. It just means that you have to issue taxable debt, which will carry a higher interest rate, all things being equal, than your tax-exempt debt would be. Though I should say, though, there are a lot of good reasons to do that, and we work with a lot of clients on issuing taxable debt as well. If you're providing that kind of incentive to a manufacturing facility, it's really probably in your best interest to have some kind of guarantee from them to make sure that you can actually pay back the debt that you've taken out to provide that incentive. There are a variety of other federal regulations that also relate to the tax exemption. The first is arbitrage requirements and yield restrictions, and I don't want to go into that in much depth because it's extremely complicated, but what it really boils down to is that there are restrictions in place on the amount of interest that you can earn on your bond proceeds. So when you borrow money, you're not likely to spend all of it right away when you first take out the debt. You're likely to spend it over time, and because of that, you'll be getting some interest on it wherever you have that money deposited. You're not allowed to really earn more interest on that than you were paying on it. So if you're paying a 2% interest rate, the regulations essentially say that you can't earn more than 2% on that. At this point in time, it's basically impossible to earn more interest than you would be paying on your debt, but there have been times in the past, and there will probably be times again in the future where it is possible to earn higher than the rate that you're paying on your debt. And so, especially in those times, this is something to keep in mind. Another area that's probably unlikely to affect a lot of you is what's called bank qualification. You're able to issue up to $10 million of debt per year, tax-exempt debt, that you can designate as bank qualified, which just means that it has some special tax provisions for banks, and you're able to get a lower interest rate on that debt than you would be if it's not designated as bank qualified. I doubt that any of you routinely issue that much debt in a single year, but if you are ever coming close to that threshold, it really warrants strategizing a little bit to see if you can stay below that in 1 year by maybe splitting things up over 2 years, because the interest rate savings can be pretty substantial sometimes. The last one, and if you really highlight anything on this slide as being really important for what you're likely to come across, is reimbursement. So you're able to reimburse yourself for expenses that you incurred prior to getting the debt issue done. However, there are a couple of rules related to that. Generally speaking, those expenses need to have been in the last 18 months. And also very importantly, and this is what trips up a lot of places, is that you have to declare your intent to do that within 60 days of incurring the expense. So let's say you have a bill for your project that comes in at $100,000, you haven't issued your debt yet, you can reimburse yourself later for paying that bill, but you do need to, within 60 days of incurring that expense, declare your intent to use debt to reimburse yourself. And that can either take the form of a resolution passed by your governing body specifically related to that, or what we often recommend to our clients is to have your governing body pass a resolution that gives the authority to someone on staff to make that intent, that declaration of intent as it comes along. And that way you've done all your paperwork and you can issue debt later on down the road to cover your project. There are also some state regulations related to debt that are specific to Wisconsin. The first is the maximum term of debt. So general obligation debt has to be paid back within 20 years of being issued, whereas revenue debt can go as long as 40 years, though practically speaking, really the only time you would see it go that long is with the USDA financing that Sean was talking about. Some of the state programs only run 20 years, and commercial market transactions, there really just isn't much interest in anything longer than 20 years, so we wouldn't recommend trying to sell a revenue debt issue longer than that. Another area of state regulations is the use of your proceeds. So in terms of security markets, there isn't really any practical difference between notes and bonds, but it is a distinction that's made in Wisconsin statute. Notes are issued for 10 years or less, and bonds are issued for longer than 10 years. And with notes, you can issue those for really any governmental purpose, any public purpose. So there's no restrictions for the most part on what you can issue notes for. For bonds, though, there is a list of items in the statutes that are eligible for bond financing. And so you need to make sure that whatever project you're contemplating, if you're looking to use bonds rather than notes, is eligible for that type of project. And that's something that your financial advisor and a bond attorney could help you to assess. The last thing on here is the general obligation debt limit. So this does not apply to revenue-backed debt, but for general obligation debt, there is a limit to how much you can have outstanding at any given time, and that is 5% of your equalized value. And sometimes we get questions about where you can find your equalized value. That's a number published by the Department of Revenue every year. And so it'll change from year to year for your municipality, but your debt limit is 5% of that number. I'll spend a little bit of time on here because there are some differences depending on what type of municipality you are and how you authorize debt. So for notes, so for 10 years or less, a city and a village, you can just issue that with a majority vote by your council or board. If you're a town, though, if you have adopted village powers, then you can do notes also by a majority vote of your village board. But if you haven't, then you have to have a referendum in your town to get authorization from the electorate to do notes. Bonds can get a little bit more complicated. Villages, again, can issue those just by a majority vote of their board. A council, though, if it's new money, so this is the first time you've borrowed money for whatever particular project you're doing, first you have to pass what are called initial resolutions stating the amount and purpose of each aspect of your debt issue. Then wait 30 days. There's a petition period during which citizens can petition for a referendum. That doesn't happen very often. If you get past that 30-day period, then a majority vote of the council can issue debt. If you're doing a refunding, which is just to refinance existing debt, then a majority vote is sufficient. For a town, the same kind of distinction exists for new money versus refunding. For new money, a referendum is always going to be required if you're doing a bond issuance. If a refunding is what you're doing, though, then the same rules as applied to notes would apply. So it will depend on whether you've adopted village powers or not. This won't apply to most of you, but in some cases it makes sense to get your debt rated. It's basically a credit rating for municipal debt. And there are really 3 agencies that do that: Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch. If you ever were to get a rating, most likely you would go with Moody's or Standard & Poor's. Fitch is not very common in Wisconsin. It really They really only work with some of the largest issuers in the state. A rating can be important because a higher rating means a more secure investment in the eyes of investors and consequently lower interest rates. So the question that we ask as financial advisors, and we try to assess this in each debt issue, is the cost of getting a rating going to be offset by the lower interest rates that you might get by having it? And in a lot of cases, it's not worth it. And so you don't have to have a credit rating to do a debt issuance, but that's something that we would help you to figure out if it makes sense to do. If you do get a credit rating, they look at a few different areas. Management, which really just looks at financial policies that you have in place and whether you're following them. Your debt profile, so how much debt you have outstanding, some ratios related to that debt, like debt per capita. They'll look at your financial operations, so whether you're running balanced budgets, how much fund balance you have, and then they'll look at the local economy, and they give a lot of weight to that. And unfortunately, you have no control over that area really, but it does factor into your credit rating. Once you've gone through all of that, then it is time to sell the bonds. If you're working with some of the state or federal programs that Sean had talked about, then at this point, really, the deal has been set and you just need to go through the paperwork and secure the funds. If you're working with a bank, though, or in the commercial market, then what will happen is your financial advisor will receive the bids if this is a competitive sale, or if you've already selected whoever the purchaser is going to be, then we'll receive the final pricing to that. We'll then make some adjustments to whatever the best bid is, and then bond counsel will work with you to help prepare all of the documents and then ultimately help to close the transaction. The way this usually works is that the governing body will pass a resolution on the day of sale, adopting the terms of the debt. You won't usually close for 2 to 4 weeks after that, but the terms are set as of that day of sale. So if you sell debt today, you're going to pass the resolution in the evening. That'll set all the interest rates, the terms, maturities, any other pertinent details, and then in a few weeks, you'll end up closing and getting the money. You might be wondering if it's not the state or federal government who is actually buying this debt. The firms that tend to buy these are called Underwriters, which is just a general catch-all term that can apply to a couple of different kinds of purchasers. Sometimes these underwriters are banks that will hold the debt just in their own portfolio, but sometimes they're broker-dealer firms who will sell the bonds to their customers, who will be individuals or institutions like insurance companies. And so those are really the end purchasers. The underwriter's services don't come free, unfortunately. They are compensated through what is called an underwriter's discount in a transaction. So they'll basically take a cut that is usually expressed in dollars per thousand. So if we're talking about a $5 discount on a $1 million offering, then they're taking $5,000 of compensation. And what that will mean from your perspective is that on that $1 million offering, they will pay you $995,000. And this is an amount that we always build into the transaction to make sure that if you need $900,000 for your project, in the end, after all of the fees that are associated with the debt issue, you will have $900,000. So just in wrapping up, it can be pretty complicated to issue debt, but there's some work that goes into managing it after the fact. First of all, you have post-issuance compliance. One part of that is the arbitrage regulations that I had mentioned. The other is what is called continuing disclosure. So anything issued in the commercial markets has financial disclosure requirements that you have to follow, essentially disseminating your financial statements and sometimes some other information to a repository that's available to market participants. That's an annual thing. It's very important to do. It can be kind of a hassle, but it's important for being able to issue debt in the future that you have complied with the continuing disclosure requirements. There's debt planning. As Sean mentioned, you want to make sure that this debt issue fits into your future plans. You don't want to find out 3 years down the road that because you are paying back the debt you did now a little bit too aggressively, you've backed yourself into a corner and it's going to be hard to do other projects. And then finally, if you do have a bond rating, there is some work involved in maintaining that bond rating. Every year or two, you can expect to be contacted by the rating agencies to get really follow-up information. Sometimes it's just a questionnaire. Sometimes it can be a pretty involved phone call to see where you stand relative to when they rated you originally. And they at that point, we'll either affirm your rating or sometimes raise it and sometimes lower it. So just to conclude, if any of you are considering debt financing right now, we wanted to give you a little snapshot of where the market is. These are two indices that don't really reflect exactly the interest rates that you in particular would be likely to pay, but they do give you a good sense of the trajectory of interest rates. And this shows the last couple of years. And you can see right now that we're really at a very low point in the last 2 years. It's gone up a little since the beginning of this year, but rates have been steady for the last month or so. And then historically, if we were to drag this out to like 20 years, you would see that rates are very, very low. So this is a good time to be issuing debt if it's something that your community has a need for. And so if you have any questions, we can certainly take them. Our contact information is on here. We're available for questions at other times too.